Blood splattered across the wooden floorboards of Hank's saloon as Victor Westwood's fist connected with the jaw of a drunken cattle rustler. The year was 1878, and the small town of Redemption, Colorado, was as unforgiving as the rugged mountains that surrounded it. Victor, a 32-year-old cowboy with shoulders broad as an oak door and eyes the color of whiskey, had earned a reputation as a man who fought his own battles and everyone else's too. "That's enough," shouted Hank, the portly saloon owner, brandishing a shotgun. "Take it outside or take it nowhere, Westwood." Victor straightened his dusty black hat and wiped blood from his knuckles. The rustler was sprawled on the floor, out cold but breathing. "He started it," Victor muttered, tossing a coin onto the bar to pay for his untouched whiskey. Man can't even respect a lady's wishes to be left alone. The lady in question, a saloon girl named Daisy, had already disappeared upstairs, clearly uninterested in the aftermath of the violence done in her name. Victor hadn't expected gratitude. He never did. That wasn't why he fought. The evening air was cool when Victor stepped outside, the stars bright pinpricks against the vast Colorado sky. Redemption was a small town, just a cluster of wooden buildings huddled together against the wilderness: a general store, the saloon, a small church, a blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments necessary for frontier life. His horse, a sturdy black gelding named Midnight, stood waiting at the hitching post. Victor untied him, but before he could mount, a woman's voice called out from the shadows. "That was quite a display in there, cowboy." Victor turned to see a woman emerge from the darkness. She was tall and straight-backed, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than the frilly dresses favored by most ladies. Her auburn hair was tied back in a simple braid, and she carried a Winchester rifle with the comfortable familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "Wasn't trying to impress anyone," Victor replied gruffly. "I'm Ruby Palmer," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes, Victor noticed, were green as spring grass. "And I've been looking for you." Victor's hand instinctively moved toward his holstered Colt. "Why's that?" Ruby laughed, a rich sound that seemed to brighten the night. "You can relax, Mr. Westwood. I'm not here to kill you or arrest you. I'm here to hire you." "Not interested," Victor said, turning back to his horse. "I'm not a gun for hire." "I heard you're the best tracker in the territory," Ruby persisted. "And I need to find someone." "Plenty of bounty hunters who'd take your money," Victor said, mounting Midnight with practiced ease. "I'm just a cowboy." Ruby stepped closer, her hand resting on Midnight's flank. "They say you found the Henderson children when they got lost in the blizzard last winter. 3 days in snow so deep it buried fences, and you tracked them to that cave 10 miles from town." Victor's jaw tightened. "That was different." "Why?" "Because they were children," Ruby challenged. "The person I'm looking for is my father. He went prospecting in the high country 6 weeks ago. Nobody's heard from him since." "Your father's a grown man who knows the risks," Victor said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Prospectors disappear all the time." "He's all the family I have left," Ruby said quietly. "And he's not just any prospector. He was a surveyor for the railroad for 20 years. He knows those mountains. Something happened to him." Victor looked down at her, noting the determination in her stance and the worry in her eyes. "Miss Palmer, I've got my own troubles. I don't need more." "I don't need saving, Mr. Westwood," Ruby replied firmly. "I can track, shoot, and take care of myself. But I don't know these mountains like you do. I'm offering good money for your guidance, not your protection." Victor frowned. "If you're so capable, why not go alone?" "Because I'm not a fool," Ruby said simply. "2 sets of eyes are better than one, and you know this terrain. I've only been in Colorado for 3 weeks, searching for someone who knows the area well enough to help me." Victor sighed heavily. He'd promised himself after the last time that he wouldn't get involved in other people's problems. It always led to trouble, always led to heartache. How much? He asked finally. $50 now, 50 when we find him. Victor whistled low. That's a lot of money for a guide. I have savings, Ruby said. And like I told you, he's all I have left. Victor studied her for a long moment. There was something about the set of her jaw, the steady gaze that didn't flinch under his scrutiny. Most women in these parts looked at him with either fear or the kind of interest he didn't want. Ruby Palmer looked at him like an equal. I'll take 25 now, 25 when we find him or when you decide to give up, Victor said. And we do things my way. Agreed on the money. As for doing things your way, Ruby smiled slightly, we'll have to see about that. We leave at first light, Victor said. Meet me at the general store, bring only what you can carry on your horse, and Miss Palmer. Yes. If you slow me down or put yourself in danger, I'll bring you right back here, money or no money. Ruby nodded once. Fair enough, though I suspect, Mr. Westwood, that you'll find I'm full of surprises. As she walked away, Victor had the unsettling feeling she was right. The morning air was crisp when Ruby arrived at the general store, leading a dappled gray mare loaded with saddlebags and supplies. Victor was already waiting, his lean frame propped against the hitching post, chewing on a piece of jerky. You're prompt, he observed. That's something. Ruby patted her horse's neck. This is Pepper. She's mountain-bred and sure-footed. Victor nodded approvingly as he looked over the mare. She'll do, you travel light, that's good. I told you I know what I'm doing, Ruby said. What's our route? Victor mounted Midnight and gestured toward the mountains rising to the northwest. Your father was headed to Silver Creek Basin, right? That's what he said in his last letter, Ruby confirmed, swinging up onto Pepper's back with practiced ease. He mentioned finding promising color in a stream feeding into the basin from the east. There are a dozen streams that feed that basin, Victor said, and the whole area is riddled with abandoned mines and claims. It's going to take time. Ruby's face remained determined. Then we'd better get started. They rode out of Redemption as the sun crested the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the sage-dotted landscape. Victor set a steady pace, not too fast, clearly testing both Ruby and her horse. To his grudging admiration, she matched him stride for stride, her posture relaxed but attentive. After 2 hours of riding in relative silence, they stopped to water the horses at a small creek. Victor watched as Ruby dismounted and stretched, noting the practical way she dressed in men's trousers beneath a split riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a cotton shirt beneath a well-worn leather vest. Where'd you learn to ride like that? He asked finally. Most Eastern women I've met can barely stay on a horse without fainting. Ruby smiled as she filled her canteen. Who said I was Eastern? Your accent. Slight, but it's there. Boston, if I had to guess. Close. Providence, Rhode Island, Ruby admitted. But I grew up on my uncle's horse farm outside the city. I've been riding since I could walk. She capped her canteen and looked at him. What about you? You're not Colorado-born, Victor hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to sharing his past, especially with strangers. But there was something about Ruby Palmer that made the usual walls feel unnecessary. Texas, he said finally. Worked cattle drives from the time I was 16. Came up to Colorado after the war. Ruby nodded, not pressing for more, which Victor appreciated. Most people would have asked which side he'd fought on, what battles he'd seen. The war was still fresh enough that people had strong opinions about such things. Your father, Victor said, changing the subject. What's his name? Edward Palmer. He's 63 but strong as an ox. Silver hair, beard. About your height but broader. He was a railroad man most of his life, but gold fever hit him after my mother died 3 years ago. Has he had any luck? Ruby shrugged. Enough to keep trying, not enough to get rich, but that wasn't really the point for him. It was about the searching, the adventure of it. Her voice softened. After 30 years of marriage, I think he just couldn't bear to sit still with her gone. Victor understood that feeling all too well. Sometimes movement was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. We should reach the foothills by nightfall, he said, mounting up again. There's a good camping spot near Pine Creek. We'll start up toward the basin tomorrow. As they rode, the terrain gradually changed, the open prairie giving way to rocky foothills dotted with pine and aspen. Victor found himself impressed by Ruby's endurance and woodcraft. She rode confidently, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert but not nervous. By late afternoon, thunderclouds were building over the mountains ahead, and Victor quickened their pace. "Storm's coming," he said. "We need to make camp before it hits." They reached the sheltered grove near Pine Creek with just enough time to set up camp before the first fat raindrops began to fall. Victor quickly erected a small canvas lean-to while Ruby gathered firewood, stacking it under the shelter to keep it dry. As lightning flashed across the sky and thunder rumbled through the valley, they huddled beneath the canvas, a small fire crackling between them. Ruby produced a pot and some beans, coffee, and dried meat from her saddlebags. "Hungry?" she asked, already setting up the pot over the fire. Victor nodded, watching as she prepared the simple meal with efficient movements. "You've done this before." "I spent 3 weeks looking for you, Mr. Westwood," Ruby said, stirring the beans. "I wasn't staying at the hotel in Redemption that whole time." "Call me Victor," he said. "Mr. Westwood makes me feel like my father." Ruby nodded. "Victor, then, and I'm Ruby, not Miss Palmer." "Your father teach you to camp like this, Ruby?" She shook her head, her braids swinging with the movement. "No, that was my uncle. Father was away working most of my childhood. Uncle James practically raised me after my mother fell ill when I was 12. She passed him a tin cup of steaming beans and meat. He believed girls should know how to fend for themselves." "Wise man." "He was," Ruby agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "He died in 75, influenza." "I'm sorry." Ruby shrugged. "That's life out here, isn't it? People come and go, sometimes they don't say goodbye." She sipped her coffee. "That's why I need to find my father. He's all I have left." Victor ate in silence for a while, listening to the rain beating against the canvas above them. "What will you do if he trailed off? If he's dead," Ruby finished bluntly. "I don't know, go back east maybe, or stay out here. I've grown fond of the mountains even in just these few weeks." She looked at him directly. "What about you? Any family?" Victor stared into the fire. "Not anymore." To his surprise, Ruby didn't push. She simply nodded and refilled his coffee cup. "Thank you for agreeing to help me," she said after a while. "I know you didn't want to." "I don't make a habit of getting involved in other people's problems," Victor admitted. "Yet here you are," Ruby observed. "Here I am," he echoed, wondering himself why he'd agreed. The rain continued through the night, but by morning the sky had cleared, revealing the mountains in all their rugged glory. They broke camp quickly and set off towards Silver Creek Basin, the trail growing steeper and more challenging as they climbed. Victor was impressed by how Ruby handled the difficult terrain, never complaining even when they had to dismount and lead the horses over particularly treacherous stretches. By midday, they'd reached a ridge overlooking the basin, a sprawling valley carved by ancient glaciers, dotted with pine forests and crisscrossed by silver ribbons of water. "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed, standing in her stirrups to get a better view. "And dangerous," Victor added. "Flash floods, rock slides, bears, mountain lions, not to mention claim jumpers and outlaws hiding from the law." Ruby turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "Are you trying to frighten me into turning back, Victor?" He met her gaze steadily. "Just making sure you understand what we're getting into." "This isn't a pleasure ride." "I'm well aware of that," she said. "Now, where do we start looking?" Victor pointed to the eastern side of the basin. "Your father said he was following a stream from the east. There are 3 main creeks that feed in from that direction. We'll start with the northernmost and work our way south, checking for signs of recent activity." They made their way down into the basin, the descent almost as challenging as the climb had been. As they reached the valley floor, Victor noticed Ruby studying the surroundings with a keen eye. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Smoke," she replied. "Fresh cut wood, disturbed ground, anything that might indicate someone's been here recently." Victor nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep your eyes open for cairns, 2 little stacks of stones. Prospectors use them to mark their way or indicate a claim." They followed the first stream for several hours, finding nothing but old, abandoned diggings. The second stream proved equally fruitless. By the time they reached the third stream, the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks. "We'll need to make camp soon," Victor said. "We can continue the search tomorrow." Ruby nodded, though he could see the disappointment in her face. She'd clearly been hoping for quick results. They made camp in a small clearing near the stream, and after a simple dinner, Ruby pulled out a map from her saddlebag, spreading it on the ground between them. "This is where we are," she said, pointing to the eastern edge of the basin. "In his last letter, Father mentioned something about the Eagle's Eye. Does that mean anything to you?" Victor frowned, studying the map. "Eagle's Eye? There's no landmark with that name that I know of. Could it be a rock formation? Something that looks like an eye, perhaps?" "Possible," Victor conceded. "Or it could be a mining term I'm not familiar with." Ruby folded the map carefully. "Tomorrow, let's follow this stream to its source. If my father found color here, he might have worked his way upward." Victor agreed, and they settled in for the night, the campfire casting flickering shadows across their faces. As he laid out his bedroll, Victor found himself watching Ruby, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way the firelight caught in her auburn hair. There was something about her that intrigued him, her self-sufficiency, her directness, the way she faced challenges head-on without complaint. Most women he'd known would have been overwhelmed by the task ahead, but Ruby Palmer seemed to draw strength from it. "You're staring," Ruby said without looking up from the book she'd pulled from her pack. Victor cleared his throat. "Just thinking about tomorrow's route." Ruby smiled slightly but didn't challenge his obvious lie. "Good night, Victor." "Good night, Ruby." The next day dawned clear and warm, perfect for their search. They followed the stream upward, the terrain growing increasingly rocky and steep. Around midday, Victor noticed something, a small stack of stones placed too deliberately to be natural. "Ruby," he called, dismounting to examine the cairn. "Look at this." She was at his side instantly, her eyes brightening. "A marker." "Yes, and recent too. No moss, no weathering." Victor scanned the surrounding area. "There, another one." They followed the trail of cairns, leading their horses through increasingly rugged terrain, until they reached a small plateau overlooking the basin. There, nestled against the mountainside, was a crude cabin constructed of pine logs. Ruby's breath caught. "Do you think?" Victor held up a hand for silence, his eyes carefully scanning the area. Something didn't feel right. The cabin looked lived in. There was a woodpile stacked against one wall, and he could see what appeared to be mining equipment outside, but there was no smoke from the chimney, no movement, no sound except the whisper of wind through the pines. "Stay here," he said quietly, drawing his Colt. "I'm coming with you," Ruby countered, already pulling her Winchester from its scabbard. Victor frowned but didn't argue. They approached cautiously, moving from cover to cover until they reached the cabin door. Victor positioned himself to one side, Ruby to the other. With a nod, he pushed the door open, gun raised. The interior was dim, but as their eyes adjusted, they could make out a simple one-room dwelling, a bunk against one wall, a small table and chair, a cast iron stove in the corner. And on the bunk, a man lay motionless. "Father." Ruby rushed forward, holstering her rifle. The man on the bunk stirred weakly at the sound of her voice. He was exactly as Ruby had described, silver-haired, bearded, solidly built but clearly unwell. His face was flushed with fever and his breathing was labored. "Ruby." His voice was barely a whisper. "Is that really you, girl?" "It's me," Ruby said, kneeling beside the bunk and taking his hand. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Edward Palmer tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "Fell down a mine shaft about 2 weeks back. Broke my leg. Managed to drag myself out and back here, but the wound's gone bad." Victor approached, holstering his gun. He could see the crude splint on Palmer's right leg, and even from a distance he could smell the infection, a sickly sweet odor that never boded well. "We need to get him to a doctor," Ruby said, looking up at Victor with worry etched across her face. Victor knelt to examine the leg. The break had been set poorly, and the wound around it was inflamed, oozing pus. "He can't ride," he said grimly. "Not with this leg and not with a fever that high. The journey would kill him." Ruby's face paled. "Then what do we do? I won't leave him here to die." "We need to bring the fever down and clean that wound," Victor said. "Do you have any medical supplies?" Ruby nodded. "Basic ones. Bandages, carbolic acid, laudanum, willow bark for fever." "Get them," Victor said. "I'll heat some water." For the next hour, they worked together to treat Edward Palmer's injury. Victor cleaned the wound as best he could while Ruby administered willow bark tea for the fever. Palmer drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing his daughter, sometimes delirious with fever. "The eagle's eye," he muttered at one point, clutching at Ruby's arm. "I found it, Ruby. Rich vein, make us wealthy." "Shh, father," Ruby soothed. "Rest now. We'll talk about the eagle's eye later." When they'd done all they could for the moment, Victor stepped outside to assess their situation. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the plateau. They were at least a day's ride from the nearest town with a doctor, and he wasn't sure Palmer would survive the journey even if they could figure out how to transport him. Ruby joined him outside, her face drawn with worry. "How bad is it?" she asked directly. Victor saw no point in sugarcoating the truth. "Bad. The infection's deep and that fever's dangerous. He needs a doctor, but moving him could kill him." Ruby nodded, absorbing this. "One of us could ride for help." "It would take at least 2 days round trip, assuming the doctor's even in town when you arrive," Victor said. "And I don't like the idea of leaving either of you alone up here." Ruby paced, thinking. "What if we made a travois? Could we move him that way slowly?" Victor considered this. "Possibly. It would be rough going, but if we can get his fever down first, it might be our best option." They spent the night taking turns caring for Edward Palmer. Victor watched as Ruby tended to her father with gentle efficiency, cooling his brow with wet cloths, spooning broth into his mouth when he was lucid enough to swallow. Despite her obvious worry, she remained calm and focused, never giving in to panic or despair. In the early hours of the morning, Victor took over while Ruby caught a few hours of sleep. He sat beside Palmer's bunk, replacing the cool cloths on his forehead as needed. The older man's eyes fluttered open around dawn, clearer than they had been before. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice weak but coherent. "Victor Westwood. Your daughter hired me to find you." Palmer studied him with surprisingly shrewd eyes for a man in his condition. "You a bounty hunter?" No, just a cowboy who knows these mountains. Palmer nodded slightly. My Ruby always was a determined girl, gets that from her mother. He winced as he shifted position. How bad is it? Victor appreciated the direct question. Bad enough. The leg's infected. We're trying to get the fever down so we can move you to town. Might be too late for that, Palmer said matter-of-factly. Your daughter doesn't give up easily, Victor replied, and neither do I. Palmer managed a weak smile. Good. She deserves someone stubborn enough to match her. His eyes drifted closed again, but he continued speaking. Take care of her if I don't make it. Before Victor could respond, Ruby returned, looking slightly more rested though still worried. How is he? Fever's still high, but he was lucid for a few minutes, Victor said, standing to give her his place beside the bunk. I'm going to check on the horses and then see about making that travois. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect mountain day that usually lifted Victor's spirits. Today, however, his mind was occupied with concerns both practical and unexpectedly personal. He found himself genuinely worried about Edward Palmer, not just for Ruby's sake, but because the old prospector reminded him of his own father, tough and direct even in the face of adversity. And then there was Ruby herself. In just 2 days, she'd managed to break through barriers Victor had spent years constructing. Her competence, her determination, her unflinching acceptance of harsh realities, they all spoke to something within him that he'd thought long buried. By midday, Victor had constructed a serviceable travois using pine saplings and canvas from their tent. Ruby reported that her father's fever had dropped slightly, though the leg still looked angry and inflamed. I think we should try to move him tomorrow morning, Victor said. Give the willow bark and carbolic another day to work, then start down at first light. If all goes well, we could reach Pine Creek by nightfall, and from there it's only half a day to redemption. Ruby nodded. I'll prepare as much broth as I can today. He'll need his strength. They worked through the afternoon, Ruby tending to her father and preparing supplies for the journey while Victor reinforced the travois and planned their route. The domestic rhythm of their shared tasks felt strangely comfortable to Victor, who had grown accustomed to solitude in recent years. As the sun began to set, casting the cabin in golden light, Ruby emerged with 2 cups of coffee and joined Victor where he sat outside, whittling a piece of pine to pass the time. Father's sleeping, she said, handing him a cup. His fever's definitely lower. I think we'll be able to move him tomorrow. Victor nodded, accepting the coffee. Good. I've mapped out the easiest route back. It'll take longer, but the terrain will be gentler on the travois. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Finally, Ruby spoke. Thank you, Victor. Not just for finding my father, but for everything since. I couldn't have done this alone. Victor glanced at her, noting the quiet strength in her profile. I think you could have. You're more capable than most men I've known. Ruby smiled slightly. Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to. She turned to face him directly. Why did you agree to help me? You made it clear in town that you didn't want to get involved. Victor stared into his coffee, considering his answer. Honestly, I'm not sure. Something about the way you asked, I suppose. You didn't beg or try to appeal to my better nature. I assumed you had won without needing evidence, Ruby said with a hint of teasing. Victor chuckled, surprised at how easy it felt to laugh with her. That was your first mistake. Ruby's expression grew more serious. You've been alone a long time, haven't you? The question caught Victor off guard. Most people didn't ask such direct personal questions, and if they did, he usually deflected them. But Ruby's straightforward manner deserved an equally straightforward response. Yes, he admitted. By choice, mostly. Because of the war. Victor tensed slightly. Partly, and other things. Ruby seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. What do you think my father meant by the eagle's eye? Victor was grateful for the shift. I've been thinking about that. It could be a natural formation, a hole in a rock face that resembles an eye, visible only from certain angles. Prospectors are a superstitious lot. They see signs and omens everywhere. Father's not usually given to fanciful thinking, Ruby said. If he mentioned it, it must mean something specific. We can ask him when he's stronger, Victor suggested. For now, we should get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging. Ruby nodded and rose to her feet. Good night, Victor. Good night, Ruby. The morning brought both promise and peril. Edward Palmer's fever had broken during the night, and he was more lucid than he had been since they found him. However, the infection in his leg showed no signs of improving, and the pain was clearly excruciating despite the laudanum Ruby administered. Loading him onto the travois was an ordeal that left the old man gray-faced and sweating. Ruby whispered encouragement to him throughout, her composure slipping only once when her father let out an involuntary cry of pain. I'm sorry, she murmured, her voice breaking. We have to move you, father. Just a little longer. Victor, seeing her distress, stepped in. Mr. Palmer, bite on this, he said, offering a folded leather strap. We're going to lift on 3. 1, 2, 3. With a swift, coordinated movement, they transferred Palmer onto the travois. He bit down hard on the leather, a muffled groan escaping despite his efforts, but then it was done. Ruby quickly covered him with blankets and adjusted the pine boughs she'd placed beneath him for cushioning. Thank you, she said quietly to Victor, composing herself. The journey down from the plateau was slow and painstaking. Victor led the way, carefully choosing the smoothest path possible, while Ruby walked beside the travois, which was hitched to midnight. The big gelding moved with surprising gentleness, as if sensing the fragility of his burden. By midday, they had made it down to the basin floor, but Edward Palmer's condition was deteriorating again. His fever had returned, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, he grabbed Victor's arm as they stopped to rest. The claim papers, he rasped. In my jacket pocket, the eagle's eye, worth protecting. Victor retrieved a folded document from the inner pocket of Palmer's jacket, a claim registration for a site called Eagle's Eye Mine, with a crude map attached. He showed it to Ruby. This must be what he was talking about, she said, studying the map. But why is he so concerned about it now? Gold makes men do terrible things, Victor said grimly. If he found a rich vein, others might be looking for it too. They pushed on, making slower progress than Victor had hoped. The sun was setting as they reached a small clearing about halfway to Pine Creek. Edward Palmer was burning with fever again, and Ruby looked exhausted despite her refusal to complain. We'll stop here for the night, Victor decided. He needs rest, and so do you. They made a simple camp, transferring Palmer to a bed of pine boughs near the fire. Ruby immediately set to work trying to bring his fever down again, while Victor tended to the horses and secured their perimeter. As he gathered firewood, Victor found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Palmer's concern about the claim papers had triggered his instincts. If the old man had indeed found a rich vein, and if he'd told anyone else about it before his accident. Victor returned to camp with an armload of wood to find Ruby singing softly to her father, a lullaby that tugged at something deep in Victor's memory. She looked up as he approached, her face etched with worry. He's worse, she said simply. The fever's higher than before. Victor knelt beside them, placing a hand on Palmer's forehead. The heat radiating from the old man's skin was alarming. We need to cool him down. Is there anything cold we can use? The stream, Ruby said. I'll soak some cloths." While she went to the stream, Victor studied Palmer's leg again. The infection had spread, red streaks now extending up from the wound toward his thigh, blood poisoning. Victor had seen it before during the war. Without proper medical attention and quickly, Edward Palmer would die. Ruby returned with dripping cloths and began applying them to her father's forehead, neck, and wrists. Victor helped, neither of them speaking, both understanding the gravity of the situation. Finally, Ruby broke the silence. "He's not going to make it to town, is he?" The direct question deserved a direct answer. "I don't think so." Ruby nodded, absorbing this. There were no tears, just a tightening around her eyes. "Then we need to make him as comfortable as possible." They worked through the night, taking turns cooling Palmer's fevered body and spooning water into his mouth when he was conscious enough to swallow. Toward dawn, the old man opened his eyes, surprisingly clear despite the fever. "Ruby," he whispered. "My girl." "I'm here, Father," she said, taking his hand. "The eagle's eye," he said. "It's yours now, our future." His eyes shifted to Victor. "You're a good man, Westwood, I can tell. Take care of her." "Father, don't talk like that," Ruby said. "You need to save your strength." Palmer managed a weak smile. "Always practical, just like your mother." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Ruby girl, always have." "I love you too, Father." Palmer's eyes drifted closed again, and his breathing became more labored. Victor placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder, offering silent support as she kept vigil. As the sun rose, Edward Palmer took his last breath, slipping away peacefully with his daughter's hand in his. Ruby sat motionless for a long moment, then gently closed her father's eyes. "He's gone," she said, her voice steady despite the pain Victor could see in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ruby," Victor said, meaning it more deeply than he'd expected. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "We need to bury him properly." Victor was struck by her composure. "Are you sure you don't want to take him back to town? He loved these mountains," Ruby said simply. "He'd want to rest here, where he found his eagle's eye." They selected a spot on a small rise overlooking the basin, beneath a towering pine. Victor dug the grave while Ruby wrapped her father's body in a blanket and gathered wildflowers to place with him. Neither spoke much, the silence between them comfortable despite the sad task. When the grave was ready, they lowered Edward Palmer into it together. Ruby recited the Lord's Prayer, her voice clear in the mountain air, and then spoke a few words about her father, his love of adventure, his kindness, his determination. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" she asked Victor when she'd finished. Victor, who rarely found himself at a loss for words, struggled momentarily. "I didn't know your father long," he finally said, "but I respect a man who follows his dreams even when they lead him into danger. And I respect even more a man who raised a daughter as strong and true as you, Ruby Palmer." Ruby's composure cracked slightly at that, a single tear tracing its way down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away and nodded her thanks. After the burial, they returned to camp in silence. Victor expected Ruby to be overcome with grief now that the immediate tasks were done, but instead she pulled out her father's claim papers and spread them on a flat rock. "The eagle's eye," she said, studying the crude map. "Father was right, this is our future now." Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" Ruby looked up at him, determination replacing grief in her green eyes. "I'm going to work this claim. It's what Father would have wanted." Victor stared at her in disbelief. "Ruby, you can't be serious. Mining is dangerous, backbreaking work even for experienced men." "I'm stronger than I look," Ruby countered. "And I can learn what I don't know." "It's not just the physical danger," Victor argued. "If your father really found a rich vein, every claim jumper and thief in the territory will be after it once word gets out." "Then I'll need to be careful about who I tell," Ruby said reasonably. Victor ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This is madness. You should go back east, use your savings to start a new life. Ruby's eyes flashed. And give up everything my father worked for. Let his dream die with him. No, I won't do that. Ruby. I don't need saving, Victor, she interrupted firmly. I need your respect. If you can't give me that, then I'll thank you for your help and pay you the rest of your fee when we return to town. Victor was taken aback by her vehemence. It's not about respect, Ruby. It's about common sense. One woman alone, working a gold claim in these mountains, it's asking for trouble. Who said I'd be alone? Ruby challenged. I can hire help, trustworthy men who'll work for a fair wage. And how will you know who's trustworthy? Victor demanded. These mountains are full of desperate men who'd kill for a hint of color, let alone a rich vein. Ruby stood her ground. I'm a good judge of character. I chose you, didn't I? That stopped Victor short. He studied her face, the determination in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. She wasn't some fragile Eastern flower who needed protecting. She was Ruby Palmer, a woman who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to speak it. Yes, he conceded finally. You did, and I'm telling you, as someone who wants what's best for you, that this is a dangerous path. Ruby's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your concern, Victor, truly, but this is something I need to do for my father and for myself. Victor sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing further. Ruby Palmer had made up her mind, and from what he'd seen of her so far, she wasn't easily swayed once she'd decided on a course of action. Fine, he said, but at least let me help you get started. Make sure your claim is secure, help you hire the right men. Ruby studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'd appreciate that, but not because I need saving. No, Victor agreed with a slight smile, because I'm not leaving either, not yet anyway. They broke camp and headed back toward Redemption, Edward Palmer's claim papers securely tucked in Ruby's saddlebag. The journey was quieter without the urgency of their mission, both of them lost in their own thoughts. For Victor, those thoughts were surprisingly complicated. He'd agreed to help Ruby initially because of the money and perhaps a touch of curiosity. He'd expected to find her father, collect his fee, and return to his solitary existence. Instead, he found himself reluctantly admiring this determined woman and genuinely concerned for her welfare, feelings he hadn't experienced in years and wasn't entirely comfortable with. For her part, Ruby seemed to be processing her grief while simultaneously planning her next steps. Occasionally, she would ask Victor practical questions about mining: how deep a shaft should be, what equipment she would need, how many men would be required for a proper operation. He answered as best he could, though his knowledge of mining was limited compared to his expertise in tracking and survival. They reached Redemption 2 days later, both tired but resolved. Victor escorted Ruby to the hotel, where she took a room for an extended stay. I'll need to register father's claim officially and arrange for supplies, she said as they stood in the hotel lobby. Will you help me find reliable workers? Victor nodded. I know a few men who might be interested, former soldiers mostly, men I'd trust with my life. Thank you. Ruby reached into her pocket and pulled out the remaining $25 they'd agreed upon. Your fee, as promised. Victor looked at the money but made no move to take it. Keep it, use it for supplies. Ruby frowned. I don't accept charity, Victor. It's not charity, he said. Consider it an investment. If this eagle's eye claim is as rich as your father believed, I'd rather have a percentage than a fee. Ruby studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. A business proposition, then? Exactly, Victor agreed, relieved she understood. Very well. 10% of whatever we find in exchange for your continued assistance and expertise. Victor nodded. Deal. Over the next 2 weeks, Victor found himself drawn deeper into Ruby's plans. He helped her register the claim officially, with the Eagle's Eye mine now in her name. He introduced her to 3 men he trusted: Sam Taylor, a former Union cavalry sergeant with a gift for carpentry; Diego Morales, a Mexican-American miner with years of experience in the silver mines of Nevada; and Joe Blackhawk, a half-Cherokee scout who knew the mountains as well as Victor did. To Victor's surprise, Ruby handled these introductions with perfect aplomb, laying out her expectations clearly and offering fair wages plus a small percentage of any gold found. The men, initially skeptical of working for a woman, were won over by her directness and obvious intelligence. "Your lady friends got sand," Sam commented to Victor after their meeting at the Redemption Saloon. "Not many women would take on a mining operation, especially after losing her pa that way." "She's not my lady friend," Victor corrected automatically. "And yes, she's got more courage than most men I know." Sam gave him a knowing look but didn't push the subject. With her crew assembled and supplies ordered, Ruby prepared to return to the claim. Victor, despite his misgivings about the entire venture, found himself unable to let her go without him. "I'll escort you back up," he told her the night before their departure. They were sitting on the hotel's small veranda, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "You've done more than enough already," Ruby said. "You don't need to feel obligated." "I don't," Victor said honestly, "but I have a stake in this now, remember? 10%, Ruby smiled. "Ah, yes, your investment." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Finally, Ruby spoke again. "Why did you really agree to help me, Victor? And don't say it was the money. $25 isn't enough to make a man risk his life in these mountains." Victor considered his answer carefully. "When you first approached me outside the saloon, you said you didn't need my protection, just my guidance. Not many women or men, for that matter, would admit that they needed help without trying to appear helpless. And that impressed you." Ruby sounded skeptical. "It intrigued me," Victor corrected. "And then, when I saw how you handled yourself on the trail, no complaints, no dramatics, just practical competence, that impressed me." Ruby studied his face in the fading light. "There's more to it than that, I think." Victor sighed. She was too perceptive by half. "Maybe there is. Maybe I've been alone too long, convincing myself I don't need anyone. And then you come along saying you don't need saving, and somehow that makes me want to stay." The admission cost him something in pride, but Ruby's response made it worthwhile. She reached over and placed her hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. "Good thing I'm not leaving either," she said softly. The journey back to the claim the next day was uneventful. Their small caravan, consisting of Ruby, Victor, and the 3 men he'd recruited, along with a pack mule laden with supplies. As they neared the basin, Victor found himself increasingly alert, that same uneasy feeling returning. "Something wrong?" Ruby asked, noticing his frequent glances at the surrounding terrain. "Not sure," Victor admitted. "Just a feeling. Joe, you sense anything?" Joe Blackhawk, riding just behind them, shook his head. "Nothing obvious, but the birds are quiet." That confirmation of his own instincts was enough for Victor. "Let's approach the claim carefully. Sam, Diego, keep an eye on our back trail. Joe, scout ahead." Ruby didn't question these precautions, simply adjusting her rifle in its scabbard for easier access. They proceeded with greater caution, Joe disappearing into the trees ahead while Sam and Diego dropped back slightly, alert for any sign of pursuit. When they reached the small plateau where Edward Palmer's cabin stood, Joe was waiting for them, his expression grim. "Someone's been here," he said without preamble. Recently. Victor dismounted, hand on his Colt. How recently? Last day or two. Fire's cold, but the ashes were disturbed. They went through the cabin, then headed up toward the mine shaft. Ruby dismounted as well, her face tight with anger. Claim jumpers, likely, Victor agreed. Let's secure the cabin first, then check the mine. The cabin had indeed been ransacked, though there wasn't much to take. Palmer's few personal possessions were strewn about, and someone had pried up floorboards, presumably looking for hidden valuables. Ruby surveyed the damage with a surprisingly calm expression. They didn't find what they were looking for, she observed. The claim papers were with us, and Father kept his small pouch of dust in his saddlebags. They might still be up at the mine, Victor cautioned. Joe, can you tell how many there were? 3, maybe 4, Joe replied. Boot prints suggest at least 3 different men. Victor nodded. Ruby, you should stay here with Diego while the rest of us check the mine. To his surprise, Ruby didn't argue. Be careful. I'd rather not have to bury any more men on this mountain. The stark reminder of her father's death silenced any further discussion. Victor, Joe, and Sam approached the mine shaft carefully, following the trail that led up from the cabin through a dense stand of pines. The Eagle's Eye mine, as indicated on Palmer's map, was located about a quarter-mile from the cabin, where the mountainside had been carved away to reveal a narrow horizontal shaft. Crude support timbers framed the entrance, and a small cart sat on rails leading into the darkness. Fresh tracks, Joe murmured, crouching to examine the ground. They went in, came out again, carrying something heavy from the depth of these footprints on the way out. Victor swore under his breath. If the claim jumpers had found Palmer's gold, Ruby's plans were in serious jeopardy. Let's see what they left behind. They entered the mine shaft cautiously, Sam lighting a lantern they'd brought from the cabin. The tunnel extended about 50 feet into the mountain, ending at a rock face where signs of recent digging were evident. A pick and shovel leaned against the wall, and fresh stone chips littered the ground. Look at this, Sam said, directing the lantern light toward the rock face. A thin vein of quartz, shot through with unmistakable yellow gleams, ran diagonally across the stone. That's gold, all right. Rich vein, too. Victor examined it with a sinking feeling. If Palmer had indeed found a substantial gold deposit, word would spread quickly, bringing more claim jumpers and fortune hunters to the basin. Why would they leave this? Joe asked, puzzled. They must have seen it. Maybe they took what they could easily chip out and planned to come back, Sam suggested. Or maybe they're planning something worse, trying to force Miss Palmer to sell the claim cheap by threatening her. Or they're watching the claim, planning to jump anyone who tries to work it, Victor added grimly. Let's get back to Ruby and the others. We need to secure the site before dark. They returned to the cabin to find Ruby and Diego had already begun setting things to rights, clearing up the mess left by the intruders and reinforcing the door with extra timber. What did you find? Ruby asked as they approached. Good news and bad, Victor replied. The good news is your father was right. There's definitely gold in that mine, a rich vein from the look of it. The bad news is someone's already found it and took what they could easily extract. Ruby took this information with remarkable equanimity. Then we'll need to establish shifts for guard duty and start work immediately to extract what remains. It's not that simple, Victor cautioned. Whoever took that gold might be watching us right now, planning their next move. All the more reason to establish our presence firmly and quickly, Ruby countered. I won't be driven off my father's claim by thieves. Her determination was admirable, if potentially dangerous. Victor exchanged glances with the other men, seeing his own concerns reflected in their expressions. We'll set up a proper camp, Victor decided. Sam, Joe, see about constructing a defensible perimeter. Diego, you know mining take a proper inventory of what we have and what we'll need. Ruby, let's talk about our next steps. As the others dispersed to their assigned tasks, Victor drew Ruby aside. This is more dangerous than we anticipated, he said quietly. Those men will be back and they won't be happy to find us here. Ruby met his gaze steadily. I'm not afraid, Victor. Maybe you should be, he replied. Fear keeps people alive in these mountains. There's a difference between caution and fear, Ruby said. I'm exercising the former without giving in to the latter. She placed a hand on his arm. I understand the risks, but this is my claim, my future. I won't abandon it at the first sign of trouble. Victor covered her hand with his own. Then we face this together, but promise me you'll be careful, Ruby. Your father asked me to look after you, and I intend to honor that promise. I'll be careful, she agreed. But I meant what I said in redemption. I don't need saving. Victor smiled slightly. And I meant what I said too. I'm not leaving either. The connection between them deepened in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Ruby Palmer might not need saving, but Victor Westwood was beginning to realize that perhaps he did not from external dangers, but from the lonely existence he'd constructed for himself after the war. They established a routine over the next few days, working the mine during daylight hours while maintaining a constant watch for intruders. Diego proved invaluable, showing Ruby the proper techniques for extracting the gold-bearing quartz without damaging the vein. Sam reinforced the mine shaft with additional timber supports and constructed a crude but effective sluice box for separating the gold from the crushed ore. Joe kept watch from various vantage points around the plateau, his keen eyes missing nothing. And Victor found himself gradually letting down his guard, not his physical vigilance, but the emotional barriers he'd maintained for so long. He watched Ruby throw herself into the work with characteristic determination, learning quickly, and never complaining despite the bruises on her hands and the exhaustion evident in her face at day's end. One evening, about a week after their return to the claim, Victor found Ruby sitting outside the cabin staring up at the stars. The others were inside, playing cards by lantern light after a long day's work. Mind some company? He asked. Ruby smiled and patted the log beside her. I was hoping you'd join me. Victor sat, acutely aware of her proximity. You're taking to mining like you were born to it, he observed. It's not so different from managing a horse farm, Ruby replied. Hard work, attention to detail, and a healthy respect for what can kill you if you're careless. Victor chuckled. That's one way of looking at it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the pines. Tell me about the war, Ruby said suddenly, if you don't mind talking about it. Victor tensed instinctively, then deliberately relaxed. If anyone had earned his trust, it was Ruby Palmer. I fought for the Union, he said. Cavalry, enlisted in '62 when I was 19. Fought mostly in the Western Theater, Arkansas, Missouri, Indian Territory. And after, Ruby prompted gently when he fell silent. Victor sighed. After was harder than during in some ways. I went back to Texas, but everything had changed, or maybe I had. My parents were dead, the ranch taken for taxes. So I drifted, worked cattle drives, tried to outrun memories. Did it work, the outrunning? No, Victor admitted. They always catch up eventually. That's why I settled in Colorado. Figured if I couldn't outrun them, I might as well find a place worth staying. Ruby nodded, understanding. And have you? Found it worth staying, I mean? Victor looked at her, really looked at her in the starlight, her strong profile, the wisps of auburn hair escaping her braid, the intelligence and compassion in her green eyes. I'm beginning to think so, he said softly. Ruby turned to meet his gaze, something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression. For a moment, Victor thought she might say more, but a sudden shout from Joe, who was on watch, shattered the moment. Riders coming, at least 6 of them. Victor was on his feet instantly, Ruby right beside him. Sam and Diego burst from the cabin, weapons ready. "Get inside," Victor told Ruby, drawing his Colt. "Bar the door." "I'm a better shot than Diego," Ruby countered, already retrieving her Winchester from where it leaned against the cabin wall. "And it's my claim thereafter." There was no time to argue. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and moments later, 6 riders emerged from the trees at the edge of the plateau. They drew up about 50 yards from the cabin, clearly assessing the situation. Victor, Ruby, and the others had taken up defensive positions, Victor and Ruby near the cabin door, Sam behind a stack of firewood, Diego at the corner of the cabin, and Joe somewhere in the surrounding trees, invisible even to his companions. "That's far enough," Victor called out. "This is private property. State your business." One rider moved forward slightly, a tall man with a bushy beard and a shotgun resting across his saddle. "Name's Garrett," he called back. "These mountains don't take kindly to claim jumpers." "The claim is registered," Ruby replied clearly. "Eagle's Eye Mine, property of Ruby Palmer. You're welcome to check the records in redemption." Garrett spat on the ground. "Palmer, eh? Would that be kin to old Ed Palmer, my father?" Ruby confirmed. "He died here 2 weeks ago. I've inherited his claim legally and properly." The men conferred briefly among themselves, their voices too low to hear. Finally, Garrett addressed them again. "We heard old Palmer struck it rich up here, found a vein rich enough to make a man forget his manners, or a woman, seems like." "What my father found is none of your concern," Ruby said firmly. "This claim is registered and we're working it legally. I suggest you move on." Garrett laughed, an ugly sound in the gathering darkness. "Little lady, you don't get to make suggestions up here. This is wild country." "Might makes right." "That's so." Victor stepped forward slightly, making sure Garrett could see his face clearly. "Then you might want to reconsider your position, Garrett. You're outgunned and outmaneuvered." Garrett's eyes narrowed as he studied Victor. "Westwood, that you?" Victor nodded once. "It is." A murmur ran through the group of riders. Victor's reputation, it seemed, preceded him, a fact he was counting on. "Didn't know you'd taken up with claim jumpers," Garrett said, though with noticeably less bravado. "I haven't," Victor replied evenly. "As Miss Palmer said, this claim is registered legally. We have the papers to prove it, and we have the manpower and firepower to defend it." Garrett assessed the situation, clearly trying to determine if they were bluffing. At that moment, a shot rang out, kicking up dirt inches from Garrett's horse's hooves. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. Joe's warning shot, Victor knew, fired from somewhere in the surrounding forest. The message was clear. They could have killed Garrett if they'd wanted to. "Next one won't miss," Victor called out calmly. "Your choice, Garrett. Ride away now or don't ride away at all." For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then Garrett reined his horse around. "This isn't over, Westwood," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." "It is for tonight," Victor replied. "And if you're smart, it's over for good. Miss Palmer is willing to hire men to work this claim for fair wages and a percentage. Violence won't be necessary if you approach honestly." Garrett spat again but made no reply. He and his men wheeled their horses and rode back into the forest, the sound of their departure gradually fading into the night. Only when they were sure the men were truly gone did the defenders relax their vigilance. Joe materialized from the trees, rifle in hand, a satisfied expression on his normally impassive face. "Nice shot," Victor told him. Joe nodded. "They'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily when gold is involved." "Then we'll be ready," Ruby said firmly. "But Victor's right, I'm willing to hire honest men. There's enough gold in that vein to make us all comfortable if we work together." "Garrett's not the type to work for a woman," Sam observed. "Too much pride and not enough sense." "Then that's his loss," Ruby replied. "But I won't be intimidated off my own claim." They doubled the watch that night, expecting Garrett and his men might try to return under cover of darkness. But the night passed uneventfully, and dawn brought renewed determination to secure the claim properly. "We need to extract enough gold to make a significant shipment back to Redemption," Ruby decided over breakfast. "Show the assayer, the bank, and the law that this is a legitimate operation. Once word gets out that we're producing, Garrett will have a harder time challenging our right to be here." Diego nodded. "The vein is rich. With all of us working, we could have a good amount within a week." They set to work with renewed vigor, Diego and Sam focusing on the mine itself, while Joe continued to keep watch and hunt for fresh meat. Victor divided his time between helping Ruby learn the finer points of mining and patrolling the perimeter of their claim. As the days passed without further incident, Victor began to hope that perhaps Garrett had decided the Eagle's Eye wasn't worth the fight. The work was proceeding well, with each day adding to their store of gold dust and small nuggets. Ruby proved to be a quick study, mastering the techniques Diego showed her and contributing ideas of her own for improving their operation. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation with Garrett, Victor found Ruby examining the claim map by lantern light, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Something wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her at the rough-hewn table. "Not wrong exactly," she replied. "Just puzzling. Look at this map my father drew. He marked the Eagle's Eye here," she pointed to a spot on the crude diagram, "but our shaft is here, about 50 yards south." Victor studied the map. Could be he made a mistake. Or maybe he found color in both locations and decided the southern spot was easier to work. "Maybe," Ruby said, unconvinced. "But my father was a surveyor for 20 years. He didn't make careless mistakes with distances and directions." Victor considered this. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we might be working the wrong vein," Ruby said. "This one is good rich enough to be worthwhile. But what if there's another, even richer deposit where he marked the Eagle's Eye?" It was an intriguing possibility. "We could explore it," Victor suggested. "Take a day to examine the area he marked." Ruby nodded. "Tomorrow, perhaps, Diego and Sam can continue working our current shaft while you and I investigate." The prospect of spending a day alone with Ruby sent an unexpected thrill through Victor. Over the past weeks, he'd found himself increasingly drawn to her intelligence, her courage, her quiet strength. But there had been little opportunity for private conversation with the constant work and vigilance required at the claim. "It's a plan," he agreed. "We'll leave at first light." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect for exploration. After explaining their intentions to the others, Victor and Ruby set out toward the location marked on Edward Palmer's map. It was higher up the mountainside, requiring a steep climb through dense forest. As they walked, Ruby spoke of her childhood in Rhode Island, her mother's long illness, and her father's devotion throughout. Victor found himself sharing stories of his own youth in Texas, his father's small cattle ranch, his mother's garden, the simple pleasures of life before the war tore everything apart. "You never married?" Ruby asked as they paused to catch their breath on a rocky outcropping. Victor shook his head. "Never found the right woman, or maybe I wasn't looking." "And now?" Ruby's question was direct, her green eyes searching his face. Victor felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. "Now I'm looking," he said quietly. Ruby held his gaze for a long moment, then smiled softly. Good. They continued upward, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they still harbored. By the time they reached the coordinates marked on the map, Victor felt as though he'd known Ruby Palmer all his life. "This should be it," Ruby said, consulting the map one last time. They stood in a small clearing on a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the basin below. The mountainside here was steep, with exposed rock faces breaking through the soil. "I don't see any obvious signs of mining activity," Victor observed, scanning the area. "Father was secretive by nature," Ruby replied. "He wouldn't have left obvious markers if he thought he'd found something valuable." They began a systematic search of the clearing and surrounding forest, looking for any sign that Edward Palmer had worked this area. After an hour of fruitless searching, Victor was beginning to think the old man had indeed made a mistake on his map. Then Ruby called out from near a massive pine tree at the edge of the clearing. "Victor, come look at this." He joined her to find she had discovered a small stack of stones, a cairn similar to those that had led them to Palmer's cabin initially. This one was partially hidden between the tree's massive roots. "A marker," Victor confirmed. "But for what?" Together, they examined the area around the cairn more closely. The ground showed no signs of digging, and there was no obvious mine shaft or excavation nearby. What would he have been marking? Ruby wondered aloud, her frustration evident. Victor stepped back, trying to see the bigger picture. The cairn sat at the base of the largest pine in the clearing, a towering giant that must have been over 100 years old. Its massive trunk was scarred on one side, perhaps from a long-ago lightning strike. "The tree," he said suddenly. "Look up." Ruby followed his gaze. About 20 feet up the trunk, there was an unusual formation, a hollow in the lightning scar that, from their angle, looked remarkably like an eye. "The eagle's eye," Ruby breathed. "It's not a mine shaft at all, it's a marker, a natural formation visible from below." Victor nodded, excitement building. "And if your father was using it as a landmark, then the gold must be nearby," Ruby finished. "But where?" They expanded their search, using the eye in the tree as a reference point. Victor noticed that from certain angles, particularly when standing directly beneath it, the eye seemed to be looking in a specific direction toward a rocky outcropping about 50 yards away. "There," he said, pointing. "That's where we need to look." The outcropping proved difficult to access, requiring them to navigate a steep, brush-covered slope. By the time they reached it, both were scratched and breathing hard. But what they found made the effort worthwhile. Concealed behind a growth of scrub pine was the entrance to a narrow crevice in the rock face. It wasn't a proper mine shaft, more like a natural fissure that had been slightly widened by human hands. Victor lit a lantern they'd brought and peered inside. "There's a passage," he reported. "Tight, but navigable." Ruby's face lit with determination. "Let's go in." The passage was indeed tight, requiring them to move sideways in some places. It extended about 30 feet into the mountainside before opening into a small natural cavern. And there, revealed in the lantern light, was what they had been seeking. A vein of quartz, thick as a man's arm, ran across the cavern wall. Unlike the vein they'd been working, which showed specks and small threads of gold, this one was liberally laced with the precious metal, rich enough that it gleamed even in the dim lantern light. "My God," Ruby whispered. "Father was right. This is extraordinary." Victor examined the vein with an expert's eye. "I've never seen anything like it. Your father found a bonanza, Ruby." There were signs that Edward Palmer had already extracted some samples, fresh tool marks on the wall, and a small canvas sack of tools tucked into a corner of the cavern. But the vein itself was largely intact, promising wealth beyond anything they had anticipated. "We need to secure this," Victor said. "Keep it secret until we can organize proper extraction." Ruby nodded, still staring at the golden vein in wonder. "Father said it was our future." He wasn't exaggerating. They carefully concealed the entrance again before making their way back down to the cabin, both acutely aware of the magnitude of their discovery. A find like this could change everything, not just for Ruby, but for everyone involved. "We'll need to be careful who we tell," Victor cautioned as they approached the claim. "A vein that rich will attract every fortune hunter and outlaw in the territory." "We'll tell Sam, Diego, and Joe," Ruby decided. "They've proven themselves trustworthy. But no one else, not until we've established proper security." Their excitement was tempered by caution as they explained their discovery to the others that evening. All three men understood the need for secrecy, and they quickly developed a plan. They would continue working the original shaft openly while quietly extracting gold from the Eagle's Eye cavern, keeping its existence hidden from outsiders. Over the next 2 weeks, their strategy proved effective. They maintained the appearance of a modestly successful mining operation at the original shaft, while secretly accumulating an impressive store of gold from the hidden cavern. Victor arranged for the first shipment to be taken to the assayer in redemption, with Sam and Joe providing armed escort. The assayer's report confirmed what they already knew: the gold from the Eagle's Eye was exceptionally pure, and the quantity was impressive enough to establish Ruby Palmer as a legitimate mining entrepreneur. She used part of the proceeds to purchase additional equipment and hire 2 more men friends of Diego's who had worked with him in Nevada and could be trusted. Through it all, Victor found himself drawing closer to Ruby. Their shared secret, the long days of work, and the quiet evenings of conversation had forged a bond between them that grew stronger with each passing day. He began to imagine a future beyond the immediate challenge of securing the claim, a future that included Ruby Palmer as more than just a business partner. One evening, about a month after their discovery of the Eagle's Eye cavern, Victor and Ruby sat alone outside the cabin. The others had gone into redemption for supplies and wouldn't return until the following day. The night was clear, the stars brilliant against the black velvet of the sky. "I received a letter from the bank today," Ruby said, breaking a comfortable silence. "They've offered to buy the claim outright, a substantial amount." Victor felt a sudden hollowness in his chest. "Are you considering it?" Ruby turned to look at him. "Should I be?" "It would be safer," Victor admitted. "You could go back east, live comfortably. No more worrying about claim jumpers or cave-ins or winter storms." "Is that what you want me to do?" Ruby asked directly. Victor met her gaze. "No," he said honestly. "That's not what I want." Ruby smiled, her face softening in the starlight. "Good, because I'm not leaving. Not the claim and not you, Victor Westwood." The simplicity of her declaration undid him. Without conscious thought, Victor reached for her, drawing her into his arms. Ruby came willingly, her hands sliding up to frame his face as their lips met in a kiss that had been building between them for weeks. It was gentle at first, then deepening as they gave in to feelings too long restrained. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads touching. "I don't need saving, Ruby Palmer," Victor murmured. "Good thing I'm not leaving either," she replied with a smile, echoing the words they'd exchanged weeks ago under very different circumstances. Victor laughed softly, joy bubbling up from a place he'd thought long dead. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his lips. "I think I have from the moment you found me outside that saloon." "I love you too," Ruby replied simply. Enough to follow you into these mountains on the strength of a rumor that you were the best tracker in Colorado. Is that how you found me? Victor asked, surprised. Ruby nodded, her eyes dancing with mischief. I asked in every town between Denver and Redemption who knew the mountains best. Your name kept coming up along with warnings that you were surly, solitary, and not likely to help. They weren't wrong, Victor admitted. They weren't entirely right either, Ruby countered, pressing another kiss to his lips. You just needed the right reason to say yes. Their newfound happiness seemed to infuse everything in the days that followed. The work proceeded smoothly, the hidden vein continuing to yield impressive amounts of gold. Ruby's operation began to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the mining community, with other claim owners seeking her advice and offering cooperation rather than competition. Even Garrett and his men seemed to have accepted the situation, especially after Ruby made good on her promise to hire honest men at fair wages, taking on two of Garrett's former companions when they approached respectfully asking for work. As summer gave way to fall, and the aspen trees turned the mountainsides to gold, Victor and Ruby began making plans for the future. They would continue developing the Eagle's Eye mine, but also build a proper home in Redemption, a place where they could contribute to the growing community while maintaining their connection to the mountains. We should be married before winter sets in, Ruby said one evening as they sat by the fire, reviewing the latest production figures from the mine. October, perhaps, while the passes are still open so we can travel to Denver for a proper honeymoon. Victor smiled at her practical approach to even this most romantic of proposals. Is that a proposal, Miss Palmer? Ruby looked up from her ledger, her expression suddenly vulnerable. Would you prefer to do the asking? Victor set aside his papers and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Ruby Palmer, you came into my life like a whirlwind, challenging everything I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted. You're the strongest, most determined, most magnificent woman I've ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Ruby's eyes glistened with tears, but her voice was steady as she replied, Yes, Victor Westwood, I will. They were married on a bright October morning in the small church in Redemption. Sam stood as Victor's best man, while Ruby had written to a cousin in Rhode Island, who arrived just in time to serve as her maid of honor. The entire town turned out for the celebration, recognizing that the union of Victor Westwood and Ruby Palmer represented something significant, the joining of frontier strength with Eastern determination, creating a partnership that would help shape the future of the community. After a 2-week honeymoon in Denver, they returned to find their new home nearly complete, a handsome 2-story structure on the edge of town, with views of the mountains Ruby had come to love as much as Victor did. The Eagle's Eye mine continued to produce, managed now primarily by Diego with occasional oversight from Victor and Ruby. As winter settled over the mountains, bringing snow and long, cozy evenings by the fire, Victor often found himself marveling at the turn his life had taken. From solitary cowboy to married mine owner, from a man who avoided entanglements to one who embraced the complex, rewarding bond he shared with his wife. What are you thinking about? Ruby asked one evening, looking up from the book she was reading by lamplight. Victor smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. How different my life would be if you hadn't been so determined to find your father. Ruby set aside her book and moved to join him on the sofa, nestling against his side. I found more than I was looking for, she admitted. When I set out from Rhode Island, I never imagined I'd end up married to a Colorado cowboy owning a gold mine. Any regrets? Victor asked, his arm tightening around her. Ruby shook her head. Not one. You. Only that it took me so long to realize what was right in front of me, Victor replied honestly. Ruby smiled. Well, we have plenty of time to make up for that. And they did. As the years passed, Victor and Ruby Westwood became pillars of the redemption community. The Eagle's Eye mine continued to produce, though in diminishing quantities as the veins were gradually exhausted. By then, however, they had diversified their interests, purchasing ranch land, where Victor raised some of the finest horses in Colorado, and establishing a small but respected bank that helped finance other local enterprises. They had children too, a son named James Edward, after Ruby's uncle and father, and a daughter they called Elizabeth Rose, who inherited her mother's auburn hair and determination along with her father's skill with horses. Through it all, their partnership remained the foundation of their success. Victor never forgot the lesson he'd learned that summer day on the mountain, that sometimes the strongest people are those who can admit when they need help, and that love doesn't mean needing to be saved, it means choosing not to leave. And Ruby, for her part, never regretted her decision to stay in the wilderness that had claimed her father's life, but had also given her a home and a love she had never expected to find. The Eagle's Eye had indeed shown her the way to her future, just as her father had predicted. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Victor took Ruby back to the mountain where it had all begun. The cabin was still there, maintained now as an occasional retreat, and the view from the ridge was as spectacular as ever. They stood together looking out over the basin that had changed their lives. Was it worth it? Victor asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. All the struggles, the dangers. Ruby looked up at him, her green eyes as bright and determined as they had been the day she'd found him outside Hank's saloon. Every moment, she said simply. I didn't need saving, Victor Westwood. He smiled, completing what had become their private affirmation over the years. Good thing I wasn't leaving either.